When we communicate data across the internet, we want to be as efficient as possible. And there's all these different APIs, but luckily, all of these APIs tend to favor certain standards of how you can connect to them. One of them, what we're going to go over right now, is something called JSON. So JSON is JavaScript object notation, and it's basically just a key-value pairing. And I'm going to show you how to parse that and understand it. Again, there's other different formats for different APIs, everything from XML and SOAP, but this is one that's very common on mobile, and I want you to be really familiar with it. So here is what typical JSON looks like. Again, if you were to actually go to a web API and it were to give you JSON, this is what you would see in your web browser. So what are we actually looking at? Well, it's a structured format of key-value pairs. You can see that each key is divided with a colon between the key and the value. And each of these keys is a string. The value, however, can be one of 6 different things. And when you're looking at JSON and you want to parse it, I'm going to show you what to look for. So the first key component is an object. An object is going to have one of these. And as you can see here, this entire particular piece is one object. That would be our root JSON object. So inside of an object, you're going to have many key value pairs for that object. Another major structure is the array. So an array is just a square bracket, and you can see one right here. The difference between these is this is not necessarily ordered. This is just a key value map. But these actually have a 0 element and a 1 element, and then again a closing part of the array there. So these are going to be the major pieces of structure that you see inside of JSON. The next thing that you're going to pay attention to is the data types for actually storing data. And luckily, it's just very simple. There's just 4 types. Numbers, as you can see right here for this age one, we see that the number does not have any quotes around it. Strings, which you can see all throughout here, and again, they have quotes around them. Booleans, which will just be the word true or false. Here it happens to be syntactically highlighted. And we don't have an example on here right now, but occasionally your value could be an empty value, and you will actually see the word null for that value. Okay, so now that we have some idea of the JSON data types, how in the world are we going to do that in code? Well, I'm going to show you a little trick to help you parse JSON on your own at the very root level. Now, again, in the future, you're probably going to use more powerful tools that'll do some of this conversion on the fly. But it's really important to know how these tools work so that you can always know and have the confidence to troubleshoot bugs if they ever come up in some JSON parsing solution. Okay, so here we have an actual parsing activity. And what it means to parse is basically to convert something from one type to another. So I've introduced another kind of Android concept here, the raw folder. The raw folder just allows you to put something, just kind of whatever you want in it. So here I've made this simple. Rather than us going to the internet, we're just going to parse a file that happens to be JSON. So in here you can see that we have ID, type, name, PPU, stuff inside. This is going to be describing a cake, but it starts with a root object. So this is a string, this is a string, this right here is a number. Notice that this number is floating point. JSON doesn't actually make a difference between something being int or floating point like that. It just makes a difference about it whether or not it's a string or not. So you'll see stuff like that. You'll also see here that we have batter. But batter is, its value is actually an array, and so we see regular pieces that are in an array, and it goes down. And this is basically how JSON works. It's all these key value nested pairs. So the way that you parse this is by typing your code a little backwards, and it'll make sense in a minute. So we're going to want to convert basically that JSON. We're going to want to pull out the values of just, let's see here. Let's just pull out the values of type. So just a list of these particular values. Regular, chocolate, blueberry. So for the key type, we just want all of that stuff to be put into a string array so we can display it on the screen. Now you may be wanting to parse something different. You might want to be actually converting all of the JSON into like a Java data structure, a Java object. You may want to just pull out maybe just a tweet, right, if you're working with the Twitter API, or maybe just the user and the date. Well, this logic that I'm going to show you about how to do it is going to work for all those situations. Okay, So the first thing that you do when you're using at least the main JSON parsing tools is you're going to have to wrap it in a try catch. There's an exception that can be thrown, a JSON exception. So we have to wrap everything when we're parsing in try and catch. Now, I want you guys to look at this from the right-hand side to the left, because it's much easier to think about it that way. S is actually just a string. This method just gets us all of that JSON as just a large string before we parse it. So here I am, and I'm saying pass that S, that string, into this JSON object as it's being created. So it's being put into its constructor. What this is going to do is it's going to create a JSON object by parsing that string. Now, if we look at our sample JSON, you can see the root element is indeed an object. It has the little curly brace. So once you go from the right and you say, okay, we have a JSON object, then I know my data type. I know my data type is going to be a JSON object. So I'm just going to name it root JSON. But if I look here and see that this happens to return this data type, and I name it here, I'm going to have a much easier time. Okay, so now, before we look at the next line, what do we want to do? Well, if I scan my code here, I'll even zoom in a little bit, you can see we have a key ID, a key type, a key name, a key PPU, a key stuff inside. Okay, stuff inside. So, okay, so rather than actually parsing that far deep, and let's go down here, let's get toppings. Again, they still have a type. So we have here, again, you can kind of see how it lines up. This is still on the same level. You can kind of follow this line down. I'll zoom in even so you can see it. ID, type, name, PPU, stuff inside. If I go down following this line, this thin little line, you can see eventually we get to the same root level. Again, separated by a comma, and we have topping. Topping is the key. We have colon. And then the question becomes, what is the value of topping if we actually want to get to these elements down here? We just do one line at a time. Well, if we look back over here, we can see that that is an array. All right, so we don't need to know anything more than just the fact that for the key topping, we have an array. And sure enough, in my code here, we're going to go from the right. We're going to start with root JSON. We're going to say, I want to get an array, because we know that it happens to have an array. And the key for that array is topping. Well, now that we have the topping, and then we know the data type, JSON array, it's going to be easiest for us to now write code that we know will be a JSON array data type. And there's a JSON array, JSON object. There's one of these for each of these kind of meta structures. So what I'm doing in this code after that is I'm actually saying, okay, I'm going to have this array of toppings. I already created a data array, but it was set to a 0 length. I'm now just making my data array of strings be a string array that is of the right size for the topping JSON. So this is just getting that ready. Because we have an array, we're going to now do a loop for each element of that array. And watch again as we go from the right-hand side. Okay, so for the first object, again, I'm going back in here. What is it? Is it a string? Is it a number? No. It's an object. I see the object symbol again. Armed with that knowledge, I don't need to worry about anything more. Again, array, the very 0 element of this particular array is an object. So if I go back in here, I'm going to use on my topping JSON, the JSON array, I'm going to call get a JSON object. Now this happens to just take a number for what element do you want. So here I'm just passing an I. Now I know my data type, and I'm going to use JSON object because I'm getting a JSON object, and save it as JSON object for now. Now, I've now traversed several levels in. I'm finally at this level, and here I have the final piece that I want. In fact, I want each of these because that's what I want to display, all these different toppings. So this type is the key. Okay, so we have the actual string for the key, its type. And again, what is the data structure? Quotes. If we look over here, quotes mean it's a string. So I'm going to go back to my parsing activity, and going again from the right-hand side, I'm going to take my JSON object. I'm going to get a string because it was in quotes. The key was type, so I put that into that method call. And I happen to know I'm going to get a string back because that's what the getString method returns. So on the other side, I happen to write my data array I, I'm going to be now putting in each of those strings into my own array of strings. From there on out, I can actually just connect that to a list adapter, and sure enough, I can display all of those particular toppings as strings in an array list. So using this backward methodology will help you parse complicated structures very quickly by not focusing on the whole noise of the situation, but just looking at each individual next element of the JSON that you need to parse.